Yes. Greetings to all of you here. And we hope a few more may drift in. Uh, it's my privilege to introduce Dan Harmeling, whom some of you already know. Dan and his brother James came from Hope College in Michigan as transfers to the University of Florida and promptly got involved in this is in 63, I believe, and they promptly got involved in the movement for civil rights. And he has a very dramatic story in what happened in those years. And he went subsequently went on to teach in Levy County for quite a number of years, but was always an activist for war, anti-war, for justice of every kind. And as you may notice from the hat that Dan is wearing, you can take the boy out of Hope, but you can't take Hope out of Dan Harmeling because he's still on the street corners with a sign saying, let's have peace on earth and let it begin here. And his wife, Kathie Sarachild, was in those same years, was at Radcliffe and writing against the uh, war in Vietnam, and also very much involved with the civil rights movement. And in the famous Mississippi summer of 1964, she went to Mississippi, as Zohara did, and so many other people, and worked with SNCC, but then went on to be a pioneer in the movement for women's liberation, for feminine liberation, as I think they called it initially. So let's turn this over to them. They have a lot more to say than I do. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for the introduction. And thank you for hosting us here today. It's a privilege to be able to share our story because everybody's life has a story. And the opportunity that I like to think is our story sometimes doesn't get told. It gets washed away with other events, especially the kind of political things that are going on now and all the adversarial things. And what we want to realize is, well, let's go back about 60 years. Because 60 years, I was 21 years old, and I was at the University of Florida. And just to correct one thing Richard said, I had identical twin brother, but when we graduated from high school, we realized we wanted to have our own identities. We just wanted to be, we need to be more than just Jim or Dan. And so Jim came right away to the University of Florida as a freshman in the fall of 1960, and I went off to Hope College. I will explain my hat. I do like this hat, but for the reason I'm wearing it now is my trip to the dermatology department and surgery means that my head is fairly heavily bandaged right now. So rather than distract from from what's going on with, and things are working out very well. I will say all of it was successful. But this way, people can look at my cap and realize I'm a strong supporter of Hope College. So what I want to first of all realize that my perspective that I'd like to share today, and there's so much, I could go all over the events at the University of Florida, and it happened for a period of 5 years that our group was very active. In fact, our faculty professor, our faculty advisor at the time was Marshall B. Jones. And when Marshall was fired in 1968 from the University of Florida, he went up to Hershey, Pennsylvania's new position and wrote a memoir, Berkeley of the South, a history of the student movement at the University of Florida. 1963 to 1968. This is available through the University of Florida library. And if you just go ahead and put in Berkeley of the South, you'll be able to get a hold of it. The other thing I wanted to do is also tell you that I think one thing that we forget sometimes is that the success, especially for those of us who were active at the University of Florida, had to do with a combination, a coalition of the Black and white students. And sometimes the University of Florida thinks, oh, civil rights, that took place at the University of Florida starting in 1971, when the Black students from the Black wanted to start a Black student movement and a Black student union. And there was a resistance by the President O'Connell, his last name was O'Connell, President O'Connell, and they sat in his office at Tigert Hall. And after they refused to leave, 51 of the Black students were arrested. And there were things that happened after that caused people to realize, yes, things needed to change, but things were changing before then. So now let's go back to 1963, and we realized on campus, this was the first, actually the first fall of 1962, the first undergraduate Black students were enrolled at the University of Florida. One of the students was Jesse Dean. Jesse Dean, a Black student from Pensacola, arrived and found that he could not eat at the College Inn restaurant right across the street from the campus. And so he, together with some of the white students and together with faculty advisor Marshall Jones, formed the Student Group for Equal Rights. And as far as I know, this is the first time there was a student movement at the University of Florida. But there's reasons why there's a sense that maybe it didn't, that 71 started it, but it didn't really start in 63. And I think because it was largely white students who felt this urge to join with Black students, form a coalition, that sometimes we forget what a powerful idea a coalition can be. And we certainly had one. What we did was we realized, let's see, there's a couple of things I want to cover before I get back to what was going on in campus. Why did I, as a white boy or white young man, 21 years old, how did I get involved in the Student Group for Equal Rights? Well, it started really as a youth living in Wisconsin and learning from my parents. They did not indoctrinate us or inoculate us. There wasn't a vaccine to put racism into our minds. That never happened. In fact, it happened in the other way around. There were a couple of ball players in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who were Black, who could, and this was in the late 40s, who could reside next to the stadium. But other than that, they were part of the baseball team, and that was pretty much what the community wanted them to say. And so my father at times would see them walking, and at one time my brother and I were with him, and he just stopped and he said, "Oh, you're ball players on the team, the local team. Would you like a ride somewhere?" And they accepted the ride, and all my brother and I realized was we were in an automobile with baseball players. And there was a better, higher standing than baseball players. And so it wasn't a racism story that my father told us, but it was led by example. These were men. It wasn't about color. It wasn't about whether they were white or Black, but that in fact, we embraced the idea that what mattered was what they were as men. And so that was an early lesson, together with other lessons. When our family moved to Florida in 1951, and again, something happened. We had the good fortune to be a part of a church that had a minister, Reverend Caxton Doggett. And I bring this report on Florida Committee on the Advisory Committee for the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Caxton Doggett was a minister of our church, and his wife, Becky, was the advisor to our Methodist Youth Fellowship. Now we had another opportunity. And this was because even though the barriers in racialized Florida, prevented Black and white students from attending school or having any kind of interaction with each other, Becky thought, well, of course, our youth group of the Methodist Church, we need to get together with the students who were Black at the local Methodist church in the Black community. And so I think it was an AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so we met with them, and that was a good experience. We were just in the same category, and we realized then it took action to bring things like this about. So thank goodness to a minister like Reverend Doggett and his wife Becky, that we realized when Jim and I had the opportunity at the University of Florida in the summer 1963, and there were demonstrations that were taking place in the city of Gainesville. And there was picketing at the movie theater, and men were trying to buy tickets. And as they were refused admission or refused a chance to purchase these tickets, a crowd formed. And I'm not going to show you the stories, but I have stories about how the crowd formed. Whites gathered there, and the Black community being adjacent to where the movie theater is, they gathered, and it made headlines. And for one, all of a sudden, Jim and I became aware of what was going on in Gainesville. Other than then, this was the summer of 1963. We were just students at the University of Florida. Now we realized it was time to get involved. And we looked at each other and said, yeah, we're going to go to the NAACP meeting. And we did. That night we signed on. We realized they were picketing other restaurants in the city, and we signed on for that. And then we realized another thing. There was a group on campus called the Student Group for Equal Rights. And we attended the meetings there. And from then on, the die was cast. Jim and I realized, first of all, a lot of people who get involved said, well, wait a minute, what are your friends going to think? What kind of stigma are you? Are you going to be rejected by your friends? Not when you have a twin brother. I didn't have a best friend. I had a twin brother, identical twin brother. So we looked at each other. We never thought in a second what other people might think. We realized we were doing the right thing. And just to let you know, Jim was already a leader. He'd been a president of the MYF, our Methodist Youth Fellowship at our church. And even though at the time when I went there from Hope College, he was a member of a fraternity. As soon as I got there and the fraternity wanted me to join as well, I said, Jim, I have no interest in fraternities. That's one thing I learned at Hope College. You got to meet friends who were from everywhere, and you didn't have friends that were designed for you from a fraternity or a sorority. So he quickly quit the fraternity. And of course, then we joined the massive nationwide movement of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I want to add a couple of things. One is when we were picketing this restaurant that refused to serve Jesse Dean. And by the way, the person that joined Jesse in testing this university restaurant that refused to serve Black students was Charles Chestnut III. Charles was one of the first active political people in Gainesville. And I got to know Charles, of course, through the NAACP. He and I were the same age. He had just gotten out of Mortuary Science College, came down because his grandfather had just died, and he came down to take over the Chestnut Funeral Home. And that was in the summer of '63. And of course, he quickly had met Jesse. And when the two of them met and they started realizing that this was segregation that they themselves were going to be a part of because it was happening all over our country, that it took place then. Part of what I consider an honor roll is a listing of over 200 faculty members at the University of Florida who signed on endorsing our picketing at the University of Florida. And I realize now, as I look over some of the names, that I'm sure they were asked to join but refused to sign. These were faculty members. I realized then, yeah, there were some segregationist faculty members. They were there. In fact, later on when Marshall Jones, I'm not going to name names, when Marshall Jones, you have to read this Berkeley of the South to find out their names. They were the very ones that opposed his tenure. They said he was causing too much unrest on campus. He shouldn't stay around. They also were not the ones who had signed on, who refused to be signed on 5 years earlier for this picketing. One thing I want to point out to you is a story of the involvement of white students on predominantly white campuses throughout the South is a book written by an author, Greg Mitchell, who wasn't there part of the civil rights movement, but he got to know some of the events. It's called Struggle for a Better South. And this is a detailed account of what happened when students realized SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, after the summer project of 1964, I'm going to check the time, they realized that they could be more effective in the South organizing in the Black community by having only Black young people be the organizers. Because too much of the old South meant that if you had whites there, maybe there was some magic of having a white organizer. And so people would automatically defer to this. They said that we've had enough of this. People need to realize in each community, they're going to organize themselves. They're not going to wait around for somebody who's white come and maybe have passage to more access to what this country has to offer. So this was formed. It was called the Struggle for a Better South. And the group was called the Southern Student Organizing Committee. It operated from 1964 to 1969. I was invited at the initial meeting to come up from Gainesville to Nashville, Tennessee. And it's a very helpful book if you want to ever follow up on this kind of thing. I guess I'm going to now ask my wife, Kathie, to continue because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I know I've just briefly maybe stimulated some of you to think, well, wait a minute, why didn't he tell me about this or that? And maybe she'll have some things of the same nature. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions. If there are no questions, of course, I guarantee you I'll have much more to say because I really appreciate an opportunity to talk with you today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. And also, I thank you very much for inviting us and providing the opportunity to reflect actually on that time and all the years since. And I hope it will inspire everybody else to reflect because our days of work for the world are not over, even though we're in our 80s. Let's not forget. We should really keep on sharing our experience, thinking about it, trying to draw lessons from it and passing them on and even taking action. One problem with growing older, of course, is that you have so much experience and so many years that condensing the reflections becomes a problem. So I really can only say a few things I could go on and on about. And please, if you know anything about this time and you get mad at me for leaving this out or leaving that out, some of it can come out in the question period. I hope it will. I hope you'll share what your experiences have been. I think one thing that may not have become clear from what Dan said about his experience is that he was a white person in the South, in the Deep South, and being for civil rights in the Deep South at a white university was very different from being for civil rights in the North. In the North, you didn't get in trouble for being for civil rights, at least at least for civil rights in the South. You couldn't get in trouble for it. I don't know about actually confronting cases of racism right in the North. That's something else. But you were something of a hero if you went South in the North. And of course, in the South, if you joined the civil rights movement, it was trouble, making good trouble, as John Lewis's Snick would say, but you could get in trouble for that. So I think for one, when I did join the civil rights movement at my last year in college and began to meet, not just read about the Southern activists, I adopted what I considered a genuine pecking order of courage. And the year you joined the civil rights movement, it seemed to me they were the bravest of the brave. The earlier you joined, the better. If you were white in the South, it was awesome, compared to what we had been. So I think that should be remembered. Now, it's true that Gainesville was called the Berkeley of the South because it was probably one of the very few Southern white universities where you didn't automatically get beaten up right there on campus for being in it. You just got jailed if you went on things like that. It was still more dangerous. But I think the big question was Florida different? I don't really think it was that different, but that's an eternal question. And right now, Florida is in the lead of going backwards. So who knows? Anyway, I was in the North. And I was introduced as being at Radcliffe, and I feel kind of torn as a feminist, whether it's abandoning feminism to say it wasn't really Radcliffe, it was really Harvard, or whether I'm being a feminist by explaining that it was really Harvard and not Radcliffe. Because we did take all the same classes with the boys, it wasn't like separate. And we didn't get credit for it, right? Although my year was the first year that it said Harvard University on the degree. But I was not very involved in the civil rights movement. I was much more involved in the peace movement. And I'll say, because I came to the college already a political activist. I already, in fact, I got it from my parents and their community of friends and the fantastic books they had around the house that I would pick up. Sometimes they didn't even know I was picking it up and reading it, Like in high school, I picked up a copy of The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. This is what really first made me a feminist. I thought it was a book about sex. And it opened my eyes about my own life. I mean, the pressure to wear high heels, her equation of high heels with the bound feet of the women of China, the restrictions on, it just was, I had heard from my parents that women were discriminated against and it was one of the problems of the world that needed to be changed. But it was like an abstract injustice when I heard about it from them. When I read about it in The Second Sex, it was my life. I could see how it related to everything in my life, really. So that's what first turned me into a feminist. But of course, I shouldn't say of course, but I wanted to help change the world in many areas, and I had a sense of the injustice. Why did I go to Harvard? I ask that question now. I feel I learned so much more after I graduated, and even before I went there from my family, than I did in those years there. I think that I went there mainly from the impulse, yes, to help change the world for the better, but I had the wrong idea then that it was changed for me forever when I went to Mississippi and got involved in the mass movement there. But I think I had the wrong idea that a lot of change happened by influencing the people at the top, by working from the top somehow. And when I went to Mississippi, I learned that's not where change really comes from. And not only that, the best ideas and the courage, that's what really, where things really get changed. Not that it's easy, but so when I went to college, I kind of went as an evangelist to kind of bring progressive ideas to Harvard. You know, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. I also, to give Harvard some credit, and not to sound like a complete traitor, I did have a sense of the Yankee scientist tradition. There was a Yankee scientist, the Yankee abolitionists, the Yankee American revolutionists and things like that. So I did have some respect for the tradition itself, that it wasn't all establishment. And I had spent many years during the summer. My father was an electronics engineer in science, and there's a marine biological laboratory in Woods Hole that was filled with, we'd go every summer because he worked there, that was filled with people, New England scientists, you know, and that kind of drew me to Cambridge and everything. So that was part of it. But anyway, while I was there, from this evangelist spirit, I signed up for the Crimson, which was the daily newspaper. I didn't just sign up, there was a competition. You were involved in a competition to get on there. At that point, there were very few women in the Crimson. In fact, I think I have to say this about things then. There was a quota for females. The Radcliffe was 1/4, the females were 1/4 the number of males at Harvard. But of course, there were much worse quotas than that. In my class of 250 women in the Radcliffe class, there was one African American. And I looked back over the years and I noticed that seemed to be the quota, one per class. And I learned also at a Harvard reunion, we were talking with an African American man, that it was the same quota at Harvard. There were 4 African American men in each Harvard class in those years, which was the same ratio, 1 out of 250, 4 out of 1,000. So that has really changed now. But as we know, this was another big surprise in life, that we were there at a time when there was the sense that things could move forward. And they were actually moving forward. I guess we could try to figure out why and what changed and but now we're in a time, in a way, just as surprising, when things are moving backward. And we have to really try to figure that out. And I don't know if I already said this, I meant to say it in the beginning, but just because we're older now, we can't stop. Our experience and our reflections are very important to share with people. So we should stay in there and get in there as long as we possibly can, and find ways. Even in this community, you could organize groups that could get involved in things, even if they're, you know, age-related things. The Gray Panthers, let's not forget, were very powerful for a while. So anyway, I was on the Crimson, and I discovered in the course of that what was going on in Vietnam. And I began to write. The way I discovered it was reading the New York Times to write these editorials I had to write just to get on the paper that wouldn't get published. They were just practice. And I had already read some I.F. Stone, his I.F. Stone's Weekly, and he would say again and again, and he illustrated that the way to read the New York Times was to read the last paragraph, because all the important news that was in the last few paragraphs, and that's where you would learn what was really going on. And so I read the last few paragraphs of an article on Vietnam, what was happening in Vietnam, by Homer Biggert. I'm forever grateful to him, because at least he put it in his last paragraphs. And it said that this communist enemy we were fighting in South Vietnam, they were fighting with captured weapons and homemade weapons. And it was an eye-opener, you know, because they were being presented as this dread enemy, you know, and that it also showed that they had popular support, that they were capturing the weapons. And making the weapons. It was completely against what we were reading in the front headlines and everything of the very same articles. So that's what got me to look much further into it. And I began to write these editorials. And I was also a member of the peace group. And again, I'll tell you the reason I was more involved in the peace movement in my college years than in the civil rights movement was that I felt in the North, civil rights, lots of people were for civil rights, but not lots of people were for peace with the Soviet Union or an end to bomb testing, or that there are problems with anti-communism. And I thought I could make more of a difference there. However, I also got involved in I guess what you'd call feminist issues. From my perch at the Crimson, I was able to do some of that. But at Radcliffe, there was a movement against the sign-in rules for women. You had to sign out to where you were going. You had to be in at a certain time. And I ran for a student government post and won it. And plus there were the Crimson editorials. Anyway, we had a referendum to end the sign-out rules. And 2/3 of the women voted to end the sign-out rules. The interesting thing to me at the time was that 1/3 didn't. 1/3 opposed it, which was my first encounter with the problem, the problem or the reality, whatever you want to call it, of female opposition to enlarging our freedom. And there were some good reasons for it. I won't go into it all, but it was an interesting experience. So anyway, in my last year at college, I was graduating. Oh, and I'll say about the freedom rides. Of course, I was reading about the freedom rides. Everybody was, and seeing the pictures of the buses getting bombed and everything. And I remember thinking of it then as incredible courage. I couldn't understand it. It actually, and this is the difference between action and your beliefs in a way. It almost seemed crazy to me. It was so courageous. I couldn't relate to it, even though I was for it and everything. And I had a friend who was one of the 4 guys at Harvard who was Black, and he decided to quit school. He had a 4-year scholarship to Harvard to quit and go down and join SNCC, first in the Atlanta office and then Mississippi. And I really told him I didn't think I should do it. He giving up his scholarship. And then I also thought it was certain death. And the reason I thought it was certain death was that I had read on my parents' bookshelf this book, Uncle Tom's Children by Richard Wright. And in it, it seemed like everybody got killed who tried to do anything. The tenant organizing, this was in the Deep South. But when Claude Weaver survived a year in Mississippi, I knew it wasn't certain death anymore. And I have to admit, that made a difference to me. So I signed up for the Mississippi Summer Project, which also seemed a very audacious thing to do. I liked the audacity of the idea, sort of like the Freedom Riders, but not quite as dangerous, I didn't think. Anyway, it had been proved that it wasn't certain death by then. And by the way, subsequently, I've learned that that's the difference between veteran troops in a war and green troops. The veteran troops don't know that it's not certain death and that this is a standard military knowledge type of thing. Anyway, what my experience in Mississippi was 2 really big things and in the civil rights movement. As I've already said, I learned that change really comes from the bottom. I had the experience of this mass movement of courageous, brilliant people. They seemed so much more brilliant than the people I had known at Harvard. I'll tell you, they were involved in day-to-day decisions and some of it was the SNCC leadership, the young Black radicals, but also the local people who were involved were just as impressive and just as involved. And I remember in Mississippi, the town that I was in Batesville, there was a civil rights leader in the town, a local person whose name was Reverend Middleton. And he would tell stories. He was so old at that point. I think he was in his 80s. Now it doesn't seem so old, but he had been around for a long time, and he would talk about things moving forward and backwards. And then was a backward time. He had lived through a somewhat forward time in Mississippi ages before, in which, right there in that little rural town of Batesville, Mississippi, there had been a literary society that both blacks and whites had been involved in, and he remembered that era. So it was utterly fascinating. I learned so much, and this was from people we didn't even know existed, and a culture of American radicalism that I had no idea existed. And one of the changes that I sort of decided I was an American from that experience. And during the anti-communist years, you worried, were you an American or were you an un-American or were you an anti-American? I decided, and I made a commitment to the United States in those years, that I still feel. Another thing that I got from Mississippi was sort of permission to be a feminist. And here's how it happened. I had been a feminist on the project, trying to get the guys to do the housework and all that, and share the housework, and always complaining when they wouldn't share the housework. I think I was probably most outspoken about that. But, and by the way, one time, I shouldn't leave this out, the notorious Stokely Carmichael, he was one of the leaders of the project, sort of blew in. He was a traveling organizer. He blew in with his entourage, and we were all sitting down for Sunday dinner at the home of one of the local leaders. And this thing happened that I'd never seen before on the project. At the end of this dinner, by the way, and the woman of the house, the mother of the house, was something of an invalid, but she had cooked the dinner and she was still doing a lot. And to me, the last thing in the world would be for the project volunteers to not do the dishes and have Mrs. Miles be the one who had to do the dishes. Well, at the end of the dinner, Stokely Carmichael, who has a bad rap on many things, but I will forever respect him as a feminist, because on the issues that really mattered, because he gets up on his own after the dinner and said, okay, I'll do the dishes. And he proceeds to do this huge pile of dishes. Anyway, we would all be sitting around at the end of the project. What should the whites do now? And the thing that Stokely Carmichael and the other, I would call them the radicals in SNCC, I gravitated toward them anyway, and I felt I was a radical, said the best thing that whites can do right now is to go fight, to figure out who your own oppressors are and go organize and fight them. We Black people have to organize ourselves right now and have to have have independence. So, oh yeah, Southern Student Organizing Committee. That was part of it, right. So that just sat around there in my mind. I immediately thought of women's liberation, even though I think the SNCC people really meant class, or they would have preferred some form of class organization. But nobody was using the term class there. They would, instead of talking about class or the working class, people were talking about poor people and poverty, which isn't the same as talking about class. I mean, if you're not terribly poor, you're still oppressed if you're a working class. And so you'd hear the term poor people and poverty, you wouldn't relate to it. But working class, if we could, but supposedly there was no such thing as class in the United States. And similarly, there was supposedly no such thing as women's oppression in the United States. I mean, we'd won the vote after all. You're liberated. If you only have 3 people in Congress, it's your own fault, right? You can vote, can't you? So we had to break through that mythology that just winning the vote was enough to win equality for women, real equality. So that's why I went in, the main reason I went into women's liberation organizing when it really began a few years later. So I think I'll stop there. Yeah. Okay.
I think what I'd like to do right now rather than continue with my many stories, which I have listed, I really want to hear from you. I want to find out if there's somebody here in our live audience or somebody in the chat room that has some issue that really is something that needs to be answered, and we certainly haven't done it today. So why don't we just silently wait for a minute and see if somebody comes up with a question of some kind.
Okay, let me check Zoom.
Okay, we're going to check the chat room, I guess.
Nobody, by the way, comments are fine, and sharing your experiences and comparing and contrasting is great, you know.
There's a question. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Kathie, as you said, a reflection. I think growing up, I lived in a small village in Riverton, Connecticut, Northwest Connecticut. And my family was the oldest family in the town, and everybody knew me. And it was a wonderful way to grow up emotionally. But my matriarch grandmother would take the Hartford Times, had Fresh Air Kids, and they offered African-American children from Hartford to come up to Riverton and spend a week or 2 weeks with families. And she encouraged that. And we always had Black children come and be part of our family for a week or so. And I think that gave me the feeling of justice that carried through. And now I'm proud to say I have 2 grandchildren from one child in each of my children's families. One's biracial and the other one is an adopted African-American child. And so I think we have the sense of justice that grew out of our understanding as children.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we have done and can do. I started a school in South Florida for disadvantaged kids going into science, and a lot of my students were African American, and I had a lot of work to do. And we were in loco parentis. We did all kinds of things, pulled them together, had group meetings, and so forth. Now I've been working with our synagogues in Gainesville have been working with the Black churches and looking in and helping with environment and all kinds of things, but additionally looking into the history and bringing the history out. And I'm going to ask a question of you guys and anybody here, because I was told something, and then when I tried to look into it more, it suddenly disappeared and nobody knew about it. And that is that during civil rights, actually historically, before that, or somewhere around Micanopy, which is where I live, the Black people, when they were hung around Micanopy, there was a Jewish white person in somewhere in Alachua who was killed because he helped them. And suddenly they told me this, and when I said, okay, because I do a lot of history for the area, suddenly nobody knows about it. So if anybody hears about it, please let me know anything about it and I'll dig into it.
I will say that there's enormous interest in this. In fact, those who live in or near what's in Gainesville called the Duck Pond, there's actually a tree that people will point to right in the middle of the duck pond where they would hang people. And yeah, the hanging tree. And I think the fact that there was a Jewish rabbi who was hung doesn't surprise me, but that there would be a complete cover up of it doesn't surprise me either. Oh, Jewish person, okay. Uh, Okay, I know there were labor organizers who were white, who were lynched. Because the last thing they wanted is for people in the Black community to organize and realize if they together as a group exercise their power, that this was going to be something that would be a game changer. I do want to add something that I think is important to know, is that in 1965 on campus, the Student Group for Equal Rights, which was our main organizing on campus, largely white, but as more Black students came on campus, Black students, so it really was a dynamic coalition. One thing that happened was we decided to have a freedom party. Not only a freedom party, but run in the student government elections. So we did. In the spring of 1965, for our candidate for president, we chose my brother, Jim Harmeling. But one of the candidates for freshman consul was one of the 3 freshman Black students. His name was Samuel Taylor. So he ran for office in 1965. We didn't win. We got about 10% of the vote. It was brand new on campus. But let's look back 1971, when what the University of Florida wants to recognize as beginning of the civil rights movement. Samuel Taylor was there. He was now the student body president. But where did it begin? Did it just happen? No, it's important to know that the Black students were organized and wanted a Black student union in 1971, but there were Black students organized before then. The other thing I wanted to mention, and there's more stories than I can have time for, the name Jesse Dean. I want to contrast the name Jesse Dean with the name Stephen Mickle. Stephen and Jesse were entered as students in the fall of 1962. Stephen went on to graduate at the University of Florida, went on to law school, became a lawyer, and in a short time was nominated and became a judge, and died prematurely, but soon after he served as a federal judge. And if you know the federal courthouse, downtown Gainesville, it's the Stephen Mickle Courthouse. Now, Stephen was busy with his studies, but so was Jesse Dean. But Jesse Dean did something else. He actually was a part of our demonstration, served as our president for a while. Not to take anything from Stephen, he did what he was going to do too. But Jesse Dean was a leader. At the same time, his consciousness was like the rest of us, being a sense of what is really going on in the country as a whole. And so when the Vietnam War came, he did like I did, and like others, he went to graduate school. But as soon as he got his degree, something happened. He got his draft notice. Jesse Dean got his draft notice. First Black student to graduate liberal arts master's degree, because Stephen went right on to law school. So this was a first. But the University of Florida doesn't recognize Jesse at all. Well, he said, well, wait a minute, why did he just disappear? No, he didn't. Jesse, together with other thousands of young men and some young women, went to Canada when they got their draft notices. And that's where Jesse Dean lives today. Successfully involved in various things in the government. And I forget what position he has. I talked with him several years ago. But it's too bad that the University of Florida can't recognize men and the accomplishments of somebody like Jesse Dean. I will say something else. We hear a lot about this. Well, wait a minute. Didn't you feel kind of guilty? Didn't you feel that you were exercising white privilege and somehow you realized your Black brothers and sisters didn't have these privileges that you did as white? I never thought of it that way. The one thing that I had more than anything else was anger. I was angry at America, angry to take a country that had so much of idealism And let's bring our American story to the rest of the world that they actually weren't living up to. The institutions weren't living up to what the promise had been because they were leaving out this, that, and the other minority populations. I was angry about it. And I also did this, especially when I met somebody like Charles Chestnut III and Jesse Dean. I was inspired to realize all my life I had been denied friendship with these men. And also some of the young women I met later on, like Zahara Simmons and other people at the University of Florida. And I realized I was angry about that too. And I realized the only thing that you can do is actually take action. And that really was something that, and again, I told you, it wasn't something I ever had to look over my shoulder and say, oh, wait a minute, what are my friends going to think? I knew in my family, I had their support, and especially my identical twin brother. We just looked at each other and said, it's time to go. It's time to act. And so we did. And so I just wanted to share that. Kathie?
Yeah, I forgot, I left out, I wanted to say something about the group that I'm still involved with. Red Stockings of the Women's Liberation Movement. This is a bookmark for a book that somebody in Red Stockings wrote recently called Birth Strike, the hidden story, I forget the subtitle, but it's about what we came to feel was the most important reason for going backward on abortion, which is this pressure to have a certain level of births in the country for the military, for cheap labor, and the old ideas that were somehow lost. Anyway, it's very good. It's in down-to-earth terms. But there's Red Stockings stands for, it was organized in 1969, and it was the first of the women's liberation organizations to begin speaking publicly about abortion. We had the first abortion speak out. And I feel proud to say that even as we've lost ground on abortion, the thing that we haven't lost ground on is that women are speaking out and telling their own, even congresswomen now tell about their abortions and the struggle to keep that right. So that our influence is still going strong in that area and is kind of a fortress in a way for this issue. But on the other side of this bookmark is an organization called National Women's Liberation, which has a branch right in Gainesville. And you can look, their websites for both organizations, redstockings.org and womensliberation.org. I'll just list, Red Stockings considers itself a think tank and archive for action. And we need help if anybody is inclined toward the history and analysis part of the movement. The National Women's Liberation is more activist, and we're connected with each other. We influence each other. But I'll just read you what their demands are, which you might get a kick out of. As feminists, we're fighting for universal health care, reproductive freedom, full access, and no coercion, shorter work week with a living wage, men take a fair share of care work, housework and emotional labor, paid parental leave, universal child care, free like the public schools, protecting and expanding Social Security, dues-paying feminism independent of corporations and their foundations. Join us today. And Red Stockings, I'll just say, the name is a made-up name. It stands for, I don't know if some of you may know the term blue stockings, which was a derogatory form for feminists in the earlier centuries. Little girl who read too much would be called, be careful, she'll become a blue stocking, that kind of thing. So we in 1969 decided to rehabilitate that term, but change it a little bit to red for revolution. So we're kind of the revolutionary blue stock. So you can find them both on the website. Yeah.
I have one more story I want to add. The name is Richard Dana Swan. This is an obituary from the Atlanta Constitution. He was an unsung hero of the civil rights movement. He also worked full-time for years and years with the Southern Christian Leadership Council. That's the organization of Martin Luther King. When Dana heard that Martin Luther King wanted people to come to Selma to join the march between Selma and Montgomery, Dana responded. Dana responded before the actual Bloody Sunday. Well, he actually arrived just after Bloody Sunday. And here's the reason why this certain thing happened. When they arrived in Selma, of course, two white students, he had another classmate at the University of Florida with him. The sheriff pulled him out of his cab and said, "Where are you going?" We said, "Well, here with SCLC." "Well, you better get to your black community right now, because otherwise you're going to be in deep trouble." So they did, and they went to what was called the Colored Motel. And this is a connection Dana had, and it speaks a lot about someone all of us know, John Lewis. He said, the room was already occupied. And I'm reading from a story he wrote in the SCLC magazine. And this happened about 20 years ago that he wrote this. "My roommate was bandaged around the head and moaning as I entered the room. He was John Lewis, suffering but enduring the pain of the beating he had received. Again, I was amazed at the grace of the practitioners of nonviolence, this time by a man who had been assaulted by billy club wielding bullies of the Alabama State Police. Jim Clark's posse of Dallas cowboy thugs and other locals. John Lewis apologized to me for interfering with my sleep because of the noise he was making in his fitful sleep. I was just thankful to be away from white Selma and among people dedicated to know what I continued to be good and just and righteous. And if I have regrets, all I can say is, why couldn't my life have started out being a part of an organization of Charles Chestnut III, of Jesse Dean, and together we could build a better community. I don't know if it's possible anymore. We may have passed that up, but I'll tell you, if you think of something, we're not guilty, we're angry. And we think that maybe there is time still for something that can be done about it. We're certainly going to try. And I think Kathie and I are, as the rest of you who are here in this course with Richard and Eve, you're doing something about it as well. So I think we're wrapping it up, right, Richard?
Right. Thank you so much. This has really been wonderful. Are there anybody on Zoom who wanted to get in on this? No hands. Okay. Well, thank you again. And it's been inspirational all around. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.